At his inauguration on March 4th, 1857, James Buchanan quickly made his position on the issue of slavery clear. As the crowd of attendees enjoyed the 1,200 gallons of ice cream provided for the occasion, Buchanan declared that the issue of slavery should be decided upon by the states and territories. He went on to emphasize that it was the United States government's duty to ensure that every citizen had the opportunity to express their opinion through their vote. He stated, "This sacred right of each individual must be preserved. That being accomplished, nothing can be fairer than to leave the people of a territory free from all foreign interference to decide their own destiny for themselves, subject only to the Constitution of the United States." However, Buchanan's reference to people was exclusive to white male voters, as Black Americans, whether enslaved or free, could not vote. In today's episode, we're going to look at the presidency of James Buchanan and how it impacted the election of 1860. Let's get started. Just 2 days after his inauguration, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its decision in the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, had lived with his owner in the state of Illinois and in the Free Territory of Wisconsin, and therefore argued that this entitled him to his freedom. The court, however, ruled that the Constitution did not recognize enslaved people as citizens, therefore denied Scott the right to sue for his freedom in federal court. The ruling further declared that enslaved people were merely property, protected by the Constitution, and that the Missouri Compromise, which had previously restricted slavery in certain territories, was unconstitutional. Buchanan influenced this decision by urging Northern Justice and fellow Pennsylvanian Robert Greer to side with the Southern majority on the court. Buchanan had been tipped off about the court's impending decision and included a clause in his inaugural address urging American citizens to accept the court's forthcoming ruling, thereby implicating himself in the controversy and drawing widespread criticism from those who opposed the decision. The reaction to the Dred Scott decision was swift and fierce. Abolitionists who saw their cause as a moral crusade vowed to defy the ruling, claiming that their mission was divinely ordained and thus above human law. Conversely, many Southerners felt vindicated by this decision, believing it only affirmed their interpretation of the Constitution. The nation was deeply divided, and Buchanan faced an incredibly challenging start to his presidency. Attempting to soothe tensions, Buchanan appointed moderates to his cabinet, steering clear of extremists from either side of the issue. Despite this effort, his Southern cabinet members remained staunchly pro-slavery. America was now a country split between the Northern Republicans who opposed slavery and the Democrats, whose members were divided between Southern pro-slavery advocates and Northern politicians who prioritized national unity, but often followed the Southern lead on slavery issues. Bleeding Kansas had become the epicenter of the slavery debate by the time Buchanan had taken office. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed 3 years earlier, had allowed the residents of Kansas to decide whether their state would become free or slaveholding. Chaos ensued as pro-slavery forces from Missouri, known as Border Ruffians, crossed into Kansas to influence the outcome in favor of slavery. In response, the anti-slavery Free Soilers in Kansas established their own government and boycotted the Constitutional Convention, which was dominated by the pro-slavery advocates. Buchanan, eager to maintain the support of pro-slavery Democrats, endorsed the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution, despite its limited support among Kansas's white population. Even Buchanan's own territorial governor warned against accepting the results. However, undeterred, Buchanan urged Congress to admit Kansas as a slave state. In Congress, Senator Stephen Douglas opposed President Buchanan's support for the Lecompton Constitution, branding it as fraudulent and inconsistent with the principle of popular sovereignty. Although Buchanan had the Senate on his side, the House of Representatives, with the help of pro-Douglas Democrats and Republicans, they were able to reach a compromise, sending the Constitution back to Kansas for another vote. And in the subsequent election, Kansas will reject slavery, paving the way for Kansas to become a free state in 1861. The handling of the Kansas crisis significantly undermined Buchanan's administration. To some, it appeared as though he was meddling with the will of the people, while to others, he was just simply viewed as ineffective. To make matters worse for Buchanan, the economy is going to slip into a recession the previous year, And in the midterm elections during Buchanan's administration, the Republicans are going to make major gains in the North and will gain control of the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, Stephen Douglas will maintain his seat in the Senate and will continue to challenge Buchanan's policies. Amid the turmoil, militant abolitionist John Brown, who had previously killed pro-slavery settlers in Kansas, planned an uprising to end slavery. In the fall of 1859, Brown and his followers seized a federal armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia, intending to spark a slave revolt. Southern fears of a Northern plot to incite slave rebellions were heightened, and Buchanan supported efforts to suppress the insurrection. Within 2 days, U.S. Marines commanded by Robert E. Lee captured Brown, who was subsequently convicted and hanged. Brown became a martyr to many abolitionists, but to Southerners, they saw his actions as proof that the North was willing to use violence to end slavery. Buchanan's inability to calm the nation only exasperated the tensions. His speeches provided very little solace. In fact, in his 1860 State of the Union address, Buchanan suggested that the American people could resolve the slavery question if they just let the states handle their own affairs without Northern interference. However, Buchanan did not address the contentious issue of slavery in the territories. Now, citing the Dred Scott decision, Southerners believed that they had the right to bring enslaved people into those territories, a notion that the Republicans flatly rejected. Amidst the domestic crises, Buchanan's foreign policy ambitions were limited. He continued to focus on expanding U.S. influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. He will continue to pursue the annexation of Cuba, though Republican opposition will thwart those efforts. Buchanan's administration is also going to succeed in getting the British to limit their presence in Central America and get them to back down in what would have been a potential military conflict over Washington's San Juan Island. Buchanan is also going to seek to assert American power in Mexico with a military incursion, although Congress, who is preoccupied with domestic issues, refuses to authorize military funds. As the 1860 presidential election approached, the nation was simmering over the issue of slavery. President Buchanan had promised during his inaugural address only to serve one term, a promise that no one was really seeking him to break amidst all the national chaos. Abraham Lincoln, who had lost the race for the U.S. Senate in his home state of Illinois to Stephen Douglas just 2 years earlier, spent the next 16 months tirelessly campaigning across the North. His strategy was to simplify his message, steering clear of the abolitionists' fiery rhetoric in favor of clear, logical arguments that would appeal and resonate with a broader audience. By the spring of 1860, Lincoln had built a strong coalition of allies within the Republican Party, many of whom owed him favors for his support in previous campaigns. This groundwork is going to pay huge dividends for him when the Republican National Convention convened in May of 1860. Lincoln's main rival for the Republican nomination was William H. Seward, a prominent former Whig who was an outspoken critic of slavery. Seward's status as the frontrunner actually became a liability because with this long political career, he had earned a long list of political enemies within the party. Lincoln, however, was relatively new to the national stage and had avoided making any major missteps, making him a more unifying candidate. At the convention held at Chicago's Wigwam building, the Republican delegates knew that the stakes were high. Initially, Seward led the first ballot, but Lincoln's campaign managers worked behind the scenes to secure crucial support from states like Indiana and Pennsylvania, promising strategic cabinet positions. On the third ballot, Lincoln will secure the party's nomination for president, and they will add Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as his running mate, further solidifying the ticket. The Republican platform was clear in its opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. However, it also addressed other important issues like the support of a protective tariff, the endorsing of a transcontinental railroad, and the proposal of a Homestead Act, which would provide free land to settlers. This platform was an appeal to the broad coalition of Northern voters, binding them together in a vision of a free labor society opposed to the expansion of slavery. The Democratic Party, in stark contrast, was deeply divided. Stephen Douglas, who was the party's leading candidate, found himself at odds with the Southern Democrats, who saw his stance on popular sovereignty as insufficiently supportive of slavery. When the Democratic National Convention convened in Charleston, South Carolina in April of 1860, tensions boiled over. Southern delegates demanded a platform supporting a federal slave code for the territories, a demand that Stephen Douglas could not endorse without losing support of Northern Democrats. The convention was deadlocked, and after 57 ballots, it adjourned without a nominee. When the Democrats reconvened in Baltimore in June, the party was even more fractured. The Southern delegates, unable to push through their pro-slavery platform, walked out and held their own convention, nominating Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky as their nominee. Meanwhile, the remaining Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas as their nominee, with Herschel V. Johnson of Georgia as his running mate. This split in the Democratic Party is going to severely weaken their chances in the general election. Amidst the turmoil, a third party will emerge, the Constitutional Union Party. This was a party mainly composed of former Whigs and Southern moderates who were uncomfortable with the radicalism of the Republicans and Democrats. The party will nominate John Bell of Tennessee and Edward Everett of Massachusetts as his running mate. The party's platform was simple: to uphold the Constitution and to preserve the Union. However, their moderate stance is going to struggle to gain momentum in a nation increasingly polarized over the issue of slavery. The campaign that followed was unlike any other. While Lincoln, Bell, and Breckinridge largely stayed off the campaign trail, adhering to the tradition of the time, Douglas broke the mold. He traveled across the country, making speeches and trying to rally support for the Union. However, his efforts were often overshadowed by questions about what would happen if Lincoln were elected. Despite his vigorous campaign, it became clear by October that Lincoln was likely to win. Republican supporters organized massive rallies, parades, and torchlight processions under the banner Wide Awakes, a youth organization that played a significant role in mobilizing voters. Lincoln's image as an honest, hardworking rail splitter of the West was promoted widely, with his supporters encouraging voters to vote yourself a farm by backing Lincoln and his Homestead Act. In contrast, Lincoln's opponents painted him as inexperienced and unsuitable for the presidency. The Southern press and pro-slavery advocates spread vicious rumors and racist propaganda, trying to discredit Lincoln by stoking fears of racial mixing and the end of the Southern way of life. However, these efforts could not stop the momentum that Lincoln's campaign had built. When the votes were finally counted, the nation stood on the brink of monumental change. Lincoln, who wasn't even on the ballot in many Southern states, won the election with a commanding lead in the Electoral College, although he only won 40% of the popular vote. Douglas, despite his widespread support, only carried one state, Missouri. Breckinridge swept the Deep South, and Bell managed to win in the more conservative Upper South. Lincoln's victory was a clear signal that the balance of power in the nation had shifted northward. His victory also marked a turning point in American history. For the first time, a president was elected who represented the interest of northern states over southern states. The election of 1860 revealed just how deeply divided the nation had become, setting the stage for the secession crisis that would soon lead to the American Civil War. In the aftermath of the election, Lincoln is going to find an unexpected ally in former rival Stephen Douglas. The Illinois senator, despite his defeat, is going to throw his full support behind the cause of preserving the Union. He's going to leverage his considerable influence to try to rally support for the Union across party lines. However, his efforts, along with Lincoln's, will be in vain as the Southern states begin to swiftly move towards secession. Southern leaders recognized that now, with a quote-unquote black Republican in the White House, it was only a matter of time before Republican control extended to Southern patronage, customs officials, and federal contracts. They feared a Republican attorney general overseeing marshals in places like Mississippi and Louisiana. They feared a Republican postmaster handling the mail in places like Georgia and Alabama, figures with views that were hostile to slavery, as noted by the South Carolina Secession Convention. Southern states saw secession as the only way to protect their way of life. As Lincoln prepared to take office, the secession crisis escalated rapidly. South Carolina led the charge by seceding from the Union on December 20th, 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's victory was confirmed. Within months, 6 more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had followed suit. These states formed the Confederate States of America in February of 1861, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. The Confederate States began seizing federal forts, arsenals, and other properties, only heightening the tensions. One of the most critical flashpoints in this period is Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina, where Confederate forces demanded the surrender of this fort, which was occupied at the time by Union troops. Major Robert Anderson, who was the commanding officer there at Fort Sumter, refused to yield, setting the stage for an inevitable confrontation. As Lincoln took office in March of 1861, he faced an unprecedented challenge, preserving the Union without sparking a full-scale war. In his inaugural address, Lincoln appealed for unity and tried to reassure the South that he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed. However, he also made it clear that secession was unacceptable and vowed to maintain federal authority over all U.S. property. Despite Lincoln's attempts to find a peaceful solution, the situation continued to deteriorate. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. The conflict that followed would last 4 long years, ultimately reshaping the nation. The election of 1860 was more than just a contest between 4 candidates. It was a referendum on the future of the United States. Lincoln's victory and the subsequent secession of the Southern states and the outbreak of the American Civil War were the culmination of decades of tension and conflict over slavery and states' rights. This election, more than any other, forced America to confront its deepest contradictions and set the stage for the transformative years that follow. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.